The steady, clinical beep of the monitor had been the metronome of Aiden Mercer's life for as long as she could remember. It was the sound she trusted more than conversation, more than comfort, more than the small mercies of sleep. Tonight, that beep counted out a different kind of time, irregular and thin, echoing under the bright neuro-ICU lights while rain hissed against the hospital windows like a private percussion. Aiden had been the kind of surgeon who could read a life in numbers, who reduced the chaos of trauma to protocol and incision. She was top of her field, meticulous, unflinching, famed for hands that steadied when everything else trembled. Her colleagues called her implacable. Her residents said she taught them to listen to monitors the way others listen to scripture. The hospital board called her an asset. Outside the wards, she cultivated distance the way some people collected books. She believed order preserved life. That belief had been the architecture of her days until the night the order failed. The pager had vibrated on her belt while she scrubbed for a routine lobectomy. She had shrugged it away, trusting the team, trusting schedules. Then the charge nurse had come into the prep room with a face Aiden had not seen in years, and the word on her lips rearranged everything: trauma. In the emergency bay, a young woman had been wheeled in with a GCS that read like a code no one wanted to solve. Intubated and unresponsive, a head wound that bled into the possibilities. Aiden had been cataloging injuries before she looked at the chart. Then she had seen the name tag, small, pale, familiar as a rumor: Aiden Mercer. She realized the patient was herself. She realized later that the ambulance crews had found her slumped in her car outside the hospital, keys still warm in her hand. The world reconfigured around that shock with a clinical velocity. In the narrow, fluorescent tunnel from ER to neuro-ICU, voices clipped into orders and readings. The smell of antiseptic and wet pavement braided into one another. And for a second, beneath the grit and light, something ancient and private rose up in her memory like a ghost of rain. They stabilized her as they always stabilized others. Intubation had been assertive, a practice thing, and sedation had been precise. CT sweep, then MRI, then a cascade of numbers. A subarachnoid bleed, shifting midline, ICP creeping up despite hyperosmolar therapy. The team discussed mannitol and hypertonic saline in the same breath they discussed prognosis and consent. A sonogram done as part of routine trauma care showed something that stopped even professionals in their tracks. There was a flicker of rhythm that did not belong to the ventilator, a small, steady beat deep inside a body that had never been only a case. That flicker would later be translated into the word everyone in the room understood and feared and strangely sheltered in equal measure: fetus. The idea that a woman who lived by protocol could have been carrying a secret life without her knowledge felt obscene and tender in the same instant. The monitor beep became two sounds, layered, one mechanical, one biological, and both demanded action. In the small pauses between ventilator breaths, memory came in shards and scent. Aiden had not imagined she could be surprised by her own past. There had been a late night a few months before, a grant celebration, a handful of champagne, and a single conversation with a man who had been both rival and athlete of the same clinical competitions she loved. Marcus Hale had been a presence in her professional orbit for a decade, brilliant, persuasive, magnetic in ways that unsettled the neat maps she drew for life. They had argued about technique in public, backed proposals that undercut one another in private, and for a night, the friction had burned into something that was not argument. That scent of rain on cobblestones crawled beneath her skin now, a smell that matched a memory of a shared umbrella, a face close and apologetic and intimate. That detail lodged itself inside the sterile reality of the ICU and refused to leave. Backstory was always a file of small truths. Aiden had grown up in a house where logic was the currency, and affection had come in parcels marked with instruction manuals. Her father had been a cardiologist who taught her to palpate life with a seriousness bordering on ritual. Her mother had been an archivist who taught her that records could become a refuge. Aiden sought refuge in the hospital because the hospital rewarded the industrious. She had trained at elite centers, published in peer-reviewed journals, won grants that made her name a shorthand for excellence. The rivalry with Marcus had been part professional, part theatrical. They had sparred over leadership of the vascular team more than once. He was the son of a prominent donor, and he navigated corridors of power with an ease that chafed against her meritocracy. The night they let down their guard had been unremarkable in all ways that mattered, until it became central to everything. She had not known then that a private misstep would later become the hinge of public consequence. She had always been careful. She had never expected to be surprised by herself. When the news that Aiden was pregnant circulated through the hospital, it traveled with the velocity of gossip and the gravity of scandal. Conversations in the staff room clipped into questions about competency, consent, timeline of conception. Marcus Hale became a person of interest, not because their names had appeared in the same profile, but because of proximity and motive. He had been on record as seeking to consolidate his laboratory and influence, and now rumors suggested his personal life threaded into motives that were anything but private. The hospital administration moved like a machine preparing to self-preserve. The board convened a closed session. The ethics committee requested a report, and the press that had once archived her achievements began to angle for a story that read well under neon. Aiden lay sedated under layers of care, while alliances rearranged themselves in her absence. The first institutional confrontation was procedural and cold. Chief of Surgery Rebecca Lang demanded a briefing. Legal counsel Serena Cole sent a terse memo about consent and guardianship. Marcus spoke to a colleague with a practice neutrality while murmuring to his own attorney. The narrative that fed itself into headlines was simple and poisonous. A top surgeon out of commission, pregnant with the child of a rival whose family had influence. The hospital feared liability, the board feared optics, and a faction of residents feared the collapse of a leader whose methods had defined their training. Meanwhile, a young investigator from Medical Affairs, Daniel Park, was quietly working a side channel. Daniel had a patient-centered reputation that made him both loved and underestimated. He started chasing logs. He pulled swipe card access records, medication dispensing machine audits, CCTV stills. He found small inconsistencies, timestamps that did not match staff narratives, a delivery of a sedative that did not appear on inventory, a cleaning crew report with a gap. He brought his findings to Nurse Emily Rodriguez, who had been on shift that night, and who remembered faces in the hallway with a clarity that surprised even herself. When the trauma team first convened in the conference room to parse what could be done for both mother and fetus, the dialogue filled every corner with urgency. The scene consisted of a tight cast. Resident Sophia Patel opened the chart and started with vitals. Nurse Emily stood by the monitor, hands steady and voice understated. Dr. Marcus Hale entered with counsel in tow, his expression measured. Chief Rebecca took control with the authority the room deferred to. Daniel waited at the edge, a folder in his hands. Serena Cole reminded the group of legal parameters. The exchanges were rapid and expanded, each actor layering fact with emotion. Sophia said, "I am reading a rising ICP and a fissure that suggests she will need a decompressive procedure now." Emily said, "Her oxygenation is stable, but lab values show a drop in hemoglobin overnight." Marcus asked, "Are we sure this is the right time to think about fetal monitoring given the neurosurgical urgency?" Rebecca said, "Both lives matter. We will coordinate neurosurgery and obstetrics, but my priority is to stop the bleed." Daniel said, "I have logs that suggest someone accessed her chart earlier with a different timestamp than recorded." Serena asked, "Who accessed what, and do we have chain of custody evidence for medication that was administered?" Emily said, "There was a medication dispensed at 0214 that did not reconcile with the EMR." Sophia said, "Prepare for intubation revision and have mannitol ready for osmotic control of ICP." Marcus said, "I will recuse if it avoids conflict, but I need clear facts." Rebecca said, "We will stabilize, then form a plan that protects both patient and institution." Daniel said, "I will bring the swipe data and CCTV stills to the committee and request an immediate audit." The dialogue was interlaced with sensory details. The metallic tang of antiseptic, the damp smear of rain on IDs, the roughness of surgical drape between gloved fingers, the warm thrum of the monitor against a nurse palm, and the sour sweetness of stress that sat in the air like static. Each phrase pushed the plot forward and thickened the strain of what was at stake. At about 1/3 into the unfolding story came a pause meant for the audience as much as for the characters. It was a moment to breathe and to ask what anyone would do trapped between devotion to duty and sympathy for a colleague. If you were in the position of those listening to the monitors and reading the logs, what decision would you make? Would you defend the technical detachment that has kept medicine objective? Or would you allow a personal connection to influence extraordinary measures? Count that moment as a crossroads. Share your view in the comments below. Start your response with the word technical or human so we can see which values you prioritize and why. Your perspective will shape how we approach the ethical issues in future episodes. This is not idle speculation. It matters that a community of professionals and citizens weigh in on the balance between expertise and empathy. The CTA lived like a small ethical lens in the middle of escalating facts. It was an invitation for viewers to become part of the moral calculus, and it landed as the hospital prepared to press forward. Investigation deepened, and with it the stakes. Daniel found a chain of emails between Marcus and a procurement vendor that referenced expedited delivery of an experimental sedative 2 weeks before the incident. He found a billing code irregularity that suggested a diverted sample from the laboratory that later reappeared in a clinical trial dossier. The evidence, when pulled into a readable form, suggested institutional malpractice and intentional obfuscation. The hospital board splintered. Victor Langley, a major donor and old ally of Marcus's family, called for discretion, while others demanded immediate transparency. The press smelled contradiction and began to pitch narratives that ate at reputations. In parallel, the medical narrative tightened around an operative plan that would put many things at risk. The team proposed a staged approach. First, a decompressive craniotomy to control intracranial pressure, then, if the mother stabilized, an in utero assessment and potential cesarean to optimize fetal survival. The technical description of the planned neurosurgical step was precise and brief. A decompressive craniotomy required creating a large bone flap to allow swollen brain tissue to herniate outward rather than compress vital structures. Intracranial pressure was monitored continuously via an external ventricular drain or parenchymal monitor, and osmotic agents such as mannitol were used. To lower cerebral edema, rapid control of bleeding and correction of coagulopathy were essential to avoid secondary ischemia. The team rehearsed incision sequences, instrumentation flow, and timing with military exactness. Before the OR, the team had a dialogue that widened into personal territory. They ran through contingency plans, and each person revealed a private calculation about risk and loyalty. Rebecca said, "We know the physiology. She has a window of maybe 4 hours before secondary injury worsens." Sophia said, "I have blood products on standby, and I will manage the line placement." Emily said, "I will be in the room, and I will not let anything be missed." Marcus said, "I want to be useful. Tell me where to stand and what to do." Daniel said, "The logs show someone attempted to edit the EMR at 010. I have a printout." Serena said, "Any non-clinical information will be sealed until legal counsel can review it." Rebecca said, "We operate for the patient, not for the media or for politics." Aiden, in unconsciousness, seemed to hang in the air like an absent partner to their debate. Sophia said, "Prepare for a complex closure and anticipate ICP spikes during bone removal." Emily said, "I will monitor fetal heart tones throughout unless maternal instability prohibits it." Marcus said, "I did not authorize any experimental drugs, and I want DNA testing to be performed as part of a full inquiry." Daniel said, "We will secure samples with chain of custody and involve Peritos for forensic analysis." The team moved in, practiced choreography, into the OR. The soundscape shifted to machines and measured breaths. Scalpel met fascia with a delicate authority. For the audience who had tracked Aiden as a clinician, the reversal was jarring. Her hands that had cut with confident geometry now lay limp beneath surgical drapes. In the middle of controlled chaos, a resident found an anomalous vial tucked in a medication drawer, unlabeled and containing a clear solution. The vial bore a lot number that matched the delivery Daniel had flagged. The presence of an unauthorized agent in the nursing supply chain reframed the procedure from purely therapeutic to investigatory. Rebecca paused the operation, her gloves still wet with irrigation fluid, and called for a hold. What followed were procedural and legal steps that could not be condensed to rumor. The hospital pharmacy audit was secured, chain of custody forms were filled and logged, and samples were sent to a certified toxicology lab. Documentation of the protocol for handling evidence was meticulous and slow, with a deliberate cadence intended to withstand scrutiny. Outside the OR, the press asked questions that demanded answers, and the hospital posted a statement that acknowledged an incident without confessing culpability. Marcus denied any involvement in tampering and offered to submit to testing. The board placed a temporary leave on anyone linked to the supply chain irregularity until the investigation concluded. Power dynamics shifted in a way that was almost visible. The advantage of old, money and influence wrestling with the blunt force of documented evidence. Moments of tension sharpened toward the operation's end when an unexpected hemorrhage forced a split decision. Aiden's ICP rose suddenly and fetal heart tones dipped. The room condensed into a handful of people making decisions that had moral weight and technical consequence. In one such moment, the senior obstetrician, Dr. Ana Velazquez, said, "We cannot wait. The fetus is at risk if maternal ICP remains uncontrolled." Sophia said, "We will attempt to control ICP with mannitol and hyperventilation and reassess in 20 minutes." Emily said, "Fetal heart rate dropped to 90. This is late deceleration and I am concerned." Rebecca said, "Proceed with decompression. We will buy time for the fetus." Marcus said, "If the fetus cannot survive, we must prioritize the mother. She is irreplaceable to this institution." Daniel said, "The CCTV timestamp shows someone accessing the supply room at 0112 and the badge matches an account under a contractor name." Serena said, "Document every intervention and collect all samples for forensic testing." That moment held two overlapping conflicts, one ethical and one investigative. It stretched across 2 paragraphs and roughly 500 characters each before it relaxed into the next beat. The character choices bore the weight of consequence. The plot advanced because those choices were made not in silence, but in the open air of team debate and recorded evidence. During the critical period, the team performed a high-risk protocol combining neurosurgical technique and obstetric caution. The surgical narrative was technical and needed to validate the credibility of actions taken. They executed a decompressive craniectomy, evacuated clot burden, controlled bleeding with bipolar cautery, and placed a parenchymal ICP monitor. Simultaneously, the obstetric team prepared for an emergent cesarean if maternal condition deteriorated. There was tight coordination between anesthesiology and neonatal care to balance uteroplacental perfusion with cerebral perfusion. Each step was timed to minutes and documented in the operating note. When they finally closed and moved Aiden to the neuro ICU, the initial postoperative hours were a blur of monitors and checks. The fetus showed signs of compromise, but with supportive measures, the heart rate recovered to a reassuring baseline. In the quiet after the storm, the evidence Daniel had gathered was finally cohesive. Toxicology returned a positive for a sedative that had no prescription in Aiden's chart. The lot number matched the vial found in the OR supply, and the supply chain audit revealed a contractor access card in the window of time when the medication disappeared. DNA sampling eventually confirmed paternity. The genetic analysis used standard STR markers and returned a high probability of paternity, linking Marcus Hale to the fetus. The report was technical and unambiguous, and it arrived with a legal weight that bent the would-be narratives into new shapes. The revelation of Marcus as the father complicated motive and made the fall from public favor swifter. Marcus's initial denials softened into statements about a consensual encounter weeks prior. The public narrative shifted from accusation of malicious interference to a tangled mix of personal error and professional responsibility. Yet the material trail of access, the vial, the edits to the EMR, these remained uncomfortable facts that suggested someone had attempted cover-up. The board convened an external review and invited peritos in forensic medicine to analyze hospital procedures. Legal teams drafted motions. The hospital placed a temporary hold on promotions and funding allocations while it rewired its governance. Slowly, the personal thread reknit itself. Aiden woke days later, blinking against a white ceiling and the persistent hum of the monitor. She remembered rain and saw her hand ache with an absence. In the first minutes there was confusion, and then the recompilation of identity that trauma survivors navigated. She asked for a mirror and read a face that had been flattened by time and processes and returned to her with a softness she did not expect. The first conversation she had was a mosaic of professional curiosity and private unease. She said, "Where was I, and why are there papers on my bedside table?" Rebecca said, "You had a bleed. We decompressed you and stabilized your ICP." Sophia said, "The fetus is being cared for, and the obstetrics team will brief you in an hour." Emily said, "You were found in your car. We are still investigating what happened." Marcus said, "I am sorry. I cannot find the right words, but I will help however you need." Daniel said, "We have secured evidence and we are cooperating with authorities." Serena said, "There are legal motions to protect your confidentiality, and we will proceed as you instruct." Aiden said, "I do not remember consenting to being pregnant, and I need to know who I can trust." Rebecca said, "Trust me, we will put the facts on the table and protect your autonomy." The conversations were long and riven with emotion. Aiden navigated them with a surgeon's mind and a human heart, deferring to data while feeling the tug of betrayal and tenderness. She struggled to reconcile the private memory of a flirtation and the public record that now bound her to a man who had been both opponent and lover. Marcus's apologies read frankly on his face, but their meaning was entangled in power dynamics and family influence. Legal proceedings followed. Serena filed for temporary guardianship to secure consent for continued maternal and fetal care while Aiden recovered capacity. The hospital instituted a transparency board, and Victor Langley recused himself from donation decisions while the audit continued. Media cycles turned and then slowed, focusing on procedural improvements the hospital pledged to adopt. Marcus faced inquiries into procurement irregularities and into whether his influence had been used to accelerate deliveries of experimental agents. Daniel's methodical work earned him a promotion in reputation and a demotion in his sleep as the weight of what he had revealed settled. Conversations evolved into quieter things. Aiden spent long afternoons with a neonatal nurse to learn the little ways to be tender to a life she had only recently discovered. Her hands, once primed for sutures and clamps, relearned gentleness. Marcus showed up awkwardly at first, bringing flowers that smelled faintly of rain and guarded apologies. The residents watched territorial lines shift and recalibrated their own ambitions. Rebecca fought battles at every committee to protect patient care above institutional reflexes. Emily, who had been at the bedside that first night, insisted that Aiden receive a full review of clinical oversight and helped her navigate the paperwork that was part treatment and part legal armor. One of the most fraught moments came when the board considered a public statement. The hospital narrative had to acknowledge error without inviting a cascade of lawsuits. The ethics committee recommended full disclosure to the family of the facts as they stood, while legal counsel recommended measured language. Aiden, awake and increasingly articulate, insisted on transparency. She said the truth should matter more than reputation. That insistence changed the tenor of the institution. It did not make consequences easy, it made them real. Moments of tension returned in private as Aiden processed paternity and the future. In one such private conversation with Daniel, she confronted the human cost of investigative work. He had brought his file and the CCTV stills, and they spoke softly in a recovery room that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and old coffee. Aiden said, "Why did you keep going when others wanted discretion?" Daniel said, "Because medicine is a promise, and promises are kept when someone remembers to keep them." Aiden said, "What will happen to Marcus if the audit finds collusion?" Daniel said, "The evidence will decide that, but society will judge in more complex ways." Aiden said, "I feel like a patient agreed on by a court, and yet I am still me." Daniel said, "You are still you, and we will make sure the decisions are yours to make." Those two paragraphs formed a tension of 500 to 600 characters divided into two parts that held the private conflict of accountability against the public consequence of disclosure. It was the kind of moral knot that refracted into other relationships: the team, the board, and the community. The legal resolution unfolded slowly.
Marcus faced administrative sanctions and was suspended pending further inquiry into procurement practices. The toxicology and access evidence made a compelling case for institutional review, though criminal charges would require proof of intentional harm. For Marcus, the political fall was sharp and personal. For Aiden, it was complicated. Paternity had been established clinically and legally, but emotions do not follow forensic timelines. There were offers of support, proposals for guardianship, and whispered speculations about career impact. The hospital offered an arrangement to place her on sabbatical and provided counseling services. A settlement framework was discussed with a hospital foundation to fund her research without the strings of the donor family. Over the weeks, Aiden healed and reflected. She met Marcus in
the mediated setting to talk about paternity and future decisions. The conversation was a tangle of regret and responsibility, and two people wrestling with what it meant to be bound by something neither one had planned to make public. Marcus said, "I am sorry about the way things happened. I never meant to cause harm." Aiden said, "Intention is not always the same as consequence, and we must live with what emerged." Marcus said, "I will accept any responsibility the process finds appropriate." Aiden said, "For now, we need to focus on health and on the child. The rest can be decided later." They agreed on limited contact and on establishing a trust to protect the child from immediate institutional pressures. The hospital instituted changes to supply chain oversight and to EMR audit trails. Daniel stayed on to help the new compliance team redesign request protocols. Rebecca continued to fight for clinical autonomy. Emily watched with a pride that was both maternal and professional. In the months that followed, life bent toward reconstruction. 1 month later, Aiden kept a ritual of listening to monitors, though now they were less clinical and more domestic. The house she returned to smelled of rain and lavender and a new, softer ordinary. She had visits from colleagues, but also from a circle of friends who understood that recovery was both bodily and generational. She met with the neonatal team regularly and began to read about parenting in the same meticulous way she had read about surgical techniques. The scandal cooled, and the institution enacted reforms to prevent supply chain tampering and to strengthen EMR integrity. Marcus was working through disciplinary processes while also appearing in hearings that explored the gray boundaries between influence and intervention. Social media had moved on, but the people who mattered to Aiden had not. 3 months later, Aiden's voice had grown steadier, though nights still carried echoes. She had resumed limited clinical activity, doing consultations and teaching. The child, still referred to by staff as the little patient, was now a name on a chart and a presence in Aiden's thoughts that reframed her priorities. She and Marcus had negotiated privacy and legal guardianship that prioritized the child welfare above posturing. The hospital offered an apology in an open statement and committed to funding external oversight. Marcus's family donated to a research fund for patient safety as part of a mediated settlement. The public narrative softened into lessons, not scapegoating. Aiden had begun to rebuild a life in which the small, sovereign decisions of daily care mattered more than her previous measures of success. 6 months from that night, the monitor beeped in her home had a different cast. It was a small baby monitor clipped to a nursery shelf that picked up the faint, contented breaths of a child who had already altered the hospital's culture. Aiden sat by the window while rain came down and let the sound of it fill her. She had returned to the hospital. She taught residents about consent and about the risks that accompany power. Marcus had accepted professional consequences and had begun work in a smaller clinic where influence was measured in competence rather than donations. They had negotiated a co-parenting agreement that put the child first. The institutional reforms seeded by the scandal had led to clearer audit trails and a culture that prized transparency. In the quiet of her home, she sometimes touched the scar at her temple, and then the small, warm hand that had learned to grip a finger. Rain on the window, the scent of antiseptic replaced now by laundry, the monitor's soft cadence, all folded into a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary. The story of Aiden Mercer was not a tidy tale of villain and savior. It was a braid of science, ethics, power, and unexpected tenderness.
It was about an institution that nearly protected itself at the cost of a patient and then learned to be better. It was about a woman who had been taught to trust numbers and who learned to trust the messy counsel of human connection. It was about the ways that medical protocol and family life collide and sometimes teach one another. If this account moved you, let us know in the comments how you feel about the balance between institutional reputation and patient truth. If you want more investigations that blend clinical detail with ethical debate, consider subscribing. We bring you stories that respect complexity and aim for accountability. In the end, the monitors were tools and also teachers. The hospital kept its protocols but changed how it interpreted warning signs. Marcus lost some of his platform and gained a quieter life that required introspection. Daniel found a new role in compliance that used his attention to detail for systemic good. Rebecca continued to defend the sanctity of clinical judgment. Emily became a patient safety officer. Aiden, whose life had been cleaved by events that no one could have predicted, found in the child a reason to redefine success and to teach a new generation about humility and care. The rain still smelled the same, but it no longer summoned shame. It summoned a beginning. If this story touched you, share your thoughts below and subscribe for more cases where medicine meets moral choice.